There's so many things to think about with climate adaptation, mitigation, but what about our historical structures? With me today, Sarah Korjeff from the Cape Cod Commission. You're a historical preservationist.
That's right. So my title is Preservation Specialist and Planner at the Cape Cod Commission, and my job really is to work with all 15 towns in the county on ways to protect their historic resources. And that could be historic buildings, or it could be cemeteries, or it could be cultural landscapes, or even artifacts. So I work with a lot of nonprofits and town committees to try to find ways to make sure that we don't lose these important resources.
Right, and there's so much history on Cape Cod, especially with our structures. You know, we have some of the oldest structures here in the country, you know, having, you know, the Pilgrims did land here first.
That's right.
But let's talk a little bit about the initiative that you're working on right now, which is to inventory these structures. So give us a little background of how this initiative started.
Sure. Well, for a long time, people have tried to maintain a list of the historic properties in their towns. And Mass Historical Commission actually maintains a statewide list of inventoried historic properties. There's a special form that people can fill out that they then have access to online, or the state puts online so people can use it as a research tool. But a lot of inventory has been done on the Cape, but we know that there are many historic properties that haven't yet been inventoried. So what we're hoping to do is fill in those holes, either working with towns or some local historical commissions to specifically to get them to address an area that we know hasn't been touched, or for us to actually go out, commission staff to go out and try to make sure that areas that haven't been inventoried in the past are inventoried now, or maybe ones that were inventoried, you know, 40 or 50 years ago, that we check them again and make sure that the inventory is up to date and that we've actually captured all of the important buildings that are out there.
All right. So let's start a little bit with the floodplain issues that we're facing as we get superstorms and as sea levels rising with this climate change. How is this impacting, or how is this making your job a little more, I guess, harder to challenging? Yes, challenging to do.
Yeah, well, I think everybody knows that we've been experiencing more storms, and we've seen a lot of coastal erosion. And for example, in Provincetown recently, we've seen a lot more inundation, you know, water actually coming in away from just the edge, the actual coastline, and impacting historic buildings. And so we've been trying to make the issue of historic properties in the flood zone one that people can pay more attention to, and we're trying to increase education and information about that. So as part of that, we've actually put out a series of maps that look at how many historic properties on Cape Cod we have inventoried and how many of those are impacted by flood hazards. So our first map shows about 11,000 properties on Cape Cod that are historic and have been inventoried. And they, the map we show color codes it a little bit so that the darkest color blue is showing us where the oldest properties are, so that would be pre-1800 properties.
Right.
And then, and I guess no surprise that those kind of follow Route 6A and some other really common transportation corridors that we know have been around for a long time. But then as the colors get a little more purpley and a little lighter blue, then those are the 1800s and the early 1900s. So out of those 11,000 properties that have been inventoried, we know actually that there are, or we're pretty certain that there are significantly more, because we know there are whole sections of the Cape that haven't been inventoried or that haven't been inventoried recently. But even if we look at that 11,000, and then we say, okay, well, how many of those properties are in flood hazard areas? We come up with roughly 2,300 properties, or about 20% of that 11,000 number, are historic buildings that could be impacted by flood hazards, and that's a big number, and that's a lot of people who would be concerned. And this is just historic properties. Of course, we know there are others that are not historic that are going to be impacted too.
Right.
But part of the reason for calling out historic properties is because there are some special regulations for them. Normally, when you make a substantial improvement to your property, you're required, if you're in a flood zone, to actually elevate it and lift it up several feet above base flood elevation. But if you're a significant historic property listed on the National Register of Historic Places, then you actually don't necessarily have to elevate. You can look for other ways to protect the building from flood hazards. And there are a lot of different ideas out there that people are using in different countries and also in different cities around the US. But some of them involve flood-proofing the lower levels of the building, or building some kind of a physical barrier immediately around the structure to protect it, or if we're talking about whole neighborhoods or districts, potentially creating barriers that would prevent floodwaters from entering an entire area.
Wow, it's fascinating to know that there's that many structures for one thing, and that there are some that probably have not been cataloged. But right here in Barnstable, that comes to mind for me is Sandy Neck. I mean, those are
That's
probably
right.
about 100 years old, right?
Yeah, or more even. So late 1800s is the date for a lot of the
Yeah.
Sandy Neck properties. And actually, it's that's one of the places that we looked specifically as an example. We picked a couple across the Cape to try to illustrate just how significant the problem is.
Right.
And Sandy Neck, we have a group of historic properties there. And not only are they inventoried, but they're also on the National Register of Historic Places. So we know they meet that certain level of significance. And there we have put together a series of maps, one that is sort of a bird's eye view that shows in red where the buildings are on the land. And then there's sort of a dotted line that shows the outline of the National Register Historic District. So all the little red building footprints you see there, those are all buildings that are recognized on the National Register of Historic Places. Of course, it includes the lighthouse and most of the other buildings we're used to seeing there. But then if you overlay a map of the flood zones, the flood hazard areas there, you can see that every single one of those buildings would be underwater. And I'm not saying completely underwater, but they would be impacted by water. And so looking at what do we do with a situation like that, how can we help these folks prepare for the future? And there's, as I said earlier, there's a lot of different possibilities. But we don't think that just lifting the buildings up in the air is necessarily going to be the best long-term solution for all of them. In some cases, some of these buildings along our coastlines have been moved there from another location way back when we didn't realize it was so common to move buildings. And so to a certain extent, we need to think about whether moving them again to higher ground is a good solution. So that's that'll be a trick. But there's a lot to consider.
So you've inventoried, I believe, is it Yarmouth so far in this initiative?
Well, so we've been doing some inventory work in Yarmouth, actually updating just 41 properties in South Yarmouth, looking to make sure that, so these are buildings that are in the South Yarmouth Historic District, and not all of them were even impacted by the flood zone, but they're properties that we knew hadn't been inventoried for a very long time, and we wanted to make sure that both the buildings and the outbuildings were up to date. And I think it's really just kind of a pilot to see whether we can, in small doses, do improved inventories like this with modest amounts of money, bringing in consultants in this case to do the work, though in some cases we may bring in just knowledgeable individuals or have commission staff do some of the work.
Right. How do residents kind of get involved in this? Like, there's a whole lot of folks with historic houses, right? So do they know that they're on this inventory already, or do they need to contact the commission? Is there a form or someplace that they can go to find out more about this?
Sure. Well, probably they might or might not know that their property's been inventoried. I'd like to think that most people would know, but probably the easiest place to find out is to go to the Mass Historical Commission website, and they have what's called the MACRIS database, and it stands for Massachusetts Cultural Resource Inventory. And there you can actually search by your town and your street address and pull up and find out whether there is a historic inventory form already on file for you. what may even be easier for a lot of folks is to contact their local historical commission. And you can start at town hall or on the town website to figure out how to do that. And chances are really good that your town actually has copies of all this data too on their own GIS database. And that's a good way to get started. And then look at the date. You know, how long ago was your inventory done? Is it somewhat recent, you know, in the last 10, 20 years, or is it really old and maybe doesn't have a whole lot of information? That may be an area where we're looking to do some updated inventory. But I also want to sort of look ahead to the future and acknowledge that you know, the flood areas we have today aren't going to be static. I mean, it will change over time, and our friends at Barnstable County Extension and Woods Hole Sea Grant have actually done a projection for the town of Barnstable looking at the number of properties that are in flood hazard areas now. And then they looked at a slightly different data set. I think they looked at pre-1900 properties. So they came up with 193 inventoried historic buildings that are in flood hazard areas today. But then when they projected forward where they anticipate those hazard areas will be by 2075, they came up with 73% more historic properties that would be impacted, so over 300. So we're really going to be looking to improve inventories, not just in the hazard areas, but even outside.
Even outside, my goodness. Absolutely fascinating work. I can't wait to see as you progress with this initiative, you know, what more you may come up with. I mean, are you finding things that are somewhat surprising to you as you're going through these inventories, or is it, you know, oh yes, we knew this?
I think we're always surprised when we find a building that hasn't been inventoried yet, when people have been thinking about historic structures here for, I don't know, you know, maybe 75 years and have been doing inventories for about 50. So it's always a little bit of a surprise that this place has snuck through the cracks, and we want to understand why, but I think we're excited when we can actually get that information out there as a research tool, and hopefully at the same time bring in more people and help them understand that we're not just looking to gather this information for ourselves, but also to help people understand the significance of their properties and get them excited about what options they have for protecting it in the long term.
Excellent. Thank you so much for coming, Sarah.
Thanks for having me, Paula.